those of you that have watched the show before, you know that we have a group of very talented people that I call my Ballotpedia All-Stars. It's the young people who are the lifeblood of the Ballotpedia website, and we interview them and talk about interesting political concepts of the day. For today's show, we have a new type of Ballotpedia All-Star. A few weeks ago, I was alerted from Ballotpedia that they have done something they hadn't done before, and they did essentially a joint venture with Dr. Carl Klarner, who is an expert in state elections. And they took Carl's expertise in research, etc., and they married it to the Ballotpedia data set. And what they've done is now produce a study, Dr. Klarner's produced a study, to actually drive down to an issue we've looked at before, and that is the lack of competitiveness in elections, and in this case, generally the lack of competitiveness in state elections. Dr. Klarner was formerly a professor at Indiana State University, and now he is a, let me get this exact term, he is a visiting scholar, I love that term, a visiting scholar at Harvard University. He is a specialist in election forecasting and in state legislative elections. So today we're going to discuss with Dr. Klarner this new study that he's done, and hopefully you'll find it a fascinating addition to the previous conversations we've had about competitiveness. Well, Dr. Klarner, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me.
It's great to have you. You're a new type of Ballotpedia All-Star. So it's a great group of young kids they have working there, and you're not a young kid. You're a lot younger than me.
Yeah, at first I thought that I would be included in that young group, so I was pretty happy about that, but that's all right.
Well, compared to me, you're definitely in that young group. There's no doubt about that. How did you find Ballotpedia, or how did they find you?
Well, everybody knows about Ballotpedia. It's the go-to site for getting current election information, and I think people go to that site a lot during elections.
Well, it's a great group. I'm glad you found each other. Now, you have a PhD in political science, and you specialize in election forecasting, state legislative elections, etc. How did this particular topic become of interest to you?
Well, there's two sides to that. One is the election forecasting side. The other one is the state legislative election side. I think forecasting is really important in the social sciences because social scientists engage in these games where they try and find statistically significant results, and they're not really accountable as far as the validity of what they're saying about one thing causing another or whatever. And so when you do forecasting, it forces you to actually understand this phenomena that you're trying to study. I'm not saying that I understand elections better than anybody else in political science, but I feel like the best way to make progress is to do this election forecasting and use election forecasting as a way to test theories, because you can't just play around with data and find statistically significant results. You have to actually get it right. You have to be able to call things before they happen, and there's no way to cheat and pretend like you knew what was going to happen before it did.
A lot of people like to do forecasting, but most of the time they're trying to predict the president, Congress. You've actually found more of a specialized niche at the state level, and how did that come to intrigue you?
So sometimes people say that state legislative elections are laboratories of democracy. You can see how different state laws will affect elections. See what the consequences of these state laws are for the democratic process. For example, campaign finance laws or something like that, or term limits. Obviously, some states have term limits, some don't. So yeah, that's why I really like studying state legislative elections.
Well, I focus on state level elections myself a lot more than I do national, and I use that term you did, the laboratory element. I think that's a fascinating part. So to put you on the spot a bit, I found an article that said you had done a forecast for the last election, 2014. How did that work out?
Oh, pretty good. It's hard to have a standard because since nobody else is doing it, it's hard to compare, how good did my model do, but I called 79 out of 86 chambers correctly of the 86 partisan chambers that were up. So that's 91.9% correct.
So somewhere along the line, you got the idea, again, to reach out to Ballotpedia, and you want to do a study on competitiveness. Why did competitiveness attract you as an issue?
Well, I think competitiveness is a compelling issue to a lot of people because if an incumbent wins an election by a landslide, then the problem is that they may not be responsive to the people. They may think, well, I'm here to stay. There's no way I'm going to lose election in the future, so I don't have to worry about what my constituents want. And then there's problems in the actual election if it's not competitive. Maybe the parties won't advertise. People won't get information about the candidates because each party knows it's a done deal, one way or the other. So they don't bother to give people information about, and the candidate doesn't bother to give people information about what they stand for, what the challenger stands for. So yeah, if the percentage of competitive elections goes down, then the concern is among many people that democracy will suffer because people aren't getting information. They're not stimulated to participate by the parties who know that they can either, they're definite to win this seat or they're not going to win the seat. And then the incumbents are not going to be responsive to people because they know that they can win re-election.
What are some of the major findings then from your study? What would you say are the major results, and were they anticipated?
Yeah, I mean, it's been found. It's been well documented for other offices like U.S. House, for the U.S. House, that competitiveness is going down. So I didn't expect it to be really any different for state legislatures, but I think there's a few things that made it. I did it there's a few tweaks that I made that allow us to look in a more accurate way at how competitiveness has changed. For example, looking at the percentage of people in the population that live in these districts, because state legislative districts are so different in size. California has 600,000 people living in a state senate district, whereas some states have far less than 10,000 people living in a state legislative district. So it's good to kind of take that into account. And then, nobody's collected and put into a database the 2014 state legislative election returns yet. I have, so it's good to go to the public with that information right away as soon as possible after the data has been collected, so that they know, this is what happened this year in the election we just had as far as trends in competitiveness. So you asked me about the major findings. The major findings were that competitiveness has gone down over time. And it's basically flatlined recently. I mean, we can say things like, it says at the beginning of the story that state senates saw the second lowest levels of competitiveness, whereas state houses showed the third lowest. But I mean, the basic point is, for the past 10 to 15 years, it's basically bottomed out. It's hard to say whether they become less competitive, very recently, because there are these short-term factors that cause competitiveness to go up and down. We've had 2006 was a wave election. 2010 was obviously a really large wave election. 2014, I call it a wavelet election because, if you go through a period where you don't have any wave elections at all because of how people are responding to, say, how ideologically extreme the president is or something like that, then you would see a reduction in competitiveness, even though the background factors are basically staying constant.
Anything that was driving this particular result, did you look behind it to see whether it was redistricting or maybe finance? Just what was driving the lack of competitiveness?
Especially for state legislature, I'm not so sure how much campaign spending is actually going to change the outcome of a race. So I tend to not emphasize that as an explanation. The general trend towards less competitiveness is because people who agree with each other just happen to be living closer together. And so we see this increase in income inequality, And we also see an increase in the correlation between income and how people vote over time. And I think that is playing into the fact that people in different areas are more like each other politically. You know, Democrats are clustering more together, Republicans are clustering more together. And so that's driving this reduction in competitiveness.
Slightly different version of the same question then, because I'm not a proponent of term limits. If you have term limits, do you think that would change your competitiveness, or does it just mean you elect the same party but a different person?
The latter. So yeah, a lot of this, so incumbents are more likely to win re-election than in the past. So if you look at the percentage of incumbents winning, and that's in the Ballotpedia study too. So the percentage of incumbents who are winning is going up over time, but strangely enough, the boost that people get from incumbency is actually falling over time. So for example, I estimate that in 1988, an incumbent would get about 7% more than a non-incumbent, everything else being equal. But in the 2014 election, that had dropped to about 3%. So 7% boost from incumbency to 3%. So the incumbents aren't getting as big of a boost anymore. But you're right, the districts are less likely to switch because people are voting their party.
Well, I greatly appreciate your time. I'm a big fan of the folks at Ballotpedia. I encourage everyone to get on the site and look at your study. Real quickly, someone wants to read your study. How do we find it?
Oh, I'll give you the URL. Just Google Ballotpedia competitiveness Klarner, and it'll probably come right up. And Klarner is Klarn, as in Nancy, ER.
Well, Dr. Klarner, thank you very much. All the best to you as you perfect your modeling, and maybe we'll have a rematch with you in 2016 and review some of your predictions.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
All the best.